Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming here tonight to hear author Berkley Hudson discuss his book, O.N. PRUITT'S POSSUM TOWN, Photographing Trouble and Resilience in the American South. My name is Morella, and I'm the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And I want to say thank you so much for coming here tonight and supporting our store. To make our events more accessible, we are recording tonight's event, and it'll be up in our YouTube channel within a few days. And lastly, we ask Berkley that he please conclude by 7 p.m. so that we can be mindful of our colleagues who are closing up the store. And now I'm going to do a short intro. Berkley Hudson is the Emeritus Associate Professor of Media History at the Missouri School of Journalism of the University of Missouri. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Not so good?
We could hear you better if the mic were up higher.
This mic is not the one. This is the mic that's recording me. So is there a way to turn it up slightly?
Or maybe you just need to turn slightly to that side when you're
I can hold it like this.
That might be the best thing.
I can hold it like this sometimes, not all the time. So, speaking of listening, I kind of worked through a number of different titles for the presentations I do on this book and the exhibit. And this one I'm calling Listening to Pictures. Listening to Pictures of O.N. PRUITT'S Trouble and Resilience. And I'm just going to read just a little bit here for a second. When Pruitt was in his heyday in 1938, and when to be a photographer was perhaps the equivalent of being a 21st internet entrepreneur, the poet-physician William Carlos Williams reviewed a New York photographic exhibit of Walker Evans at the Museum of Modern Art. In the New Republic, Williams wrote of Evans's work, some of it from the American South. The pictures talk to us. They say plenty. Likewise, the Pruitt images talk to us. They say plenty. And so, one thing I've been thinking about is the idea of listening to pictures, of smelling pictures, of tasting pictures, of hearing pictures, of feeling pictures, and the feelings that we get, the experiences we get in our physical body that's connected with our brain, how our brain works, our mind, body, how that experiences when we look at a picture, whether it's like, okay, I'm smelling wisteria now, or no, that's horrific, I can't even look at that, that's too much, I can't even think about it. So I'm going to show you some pictures in just a second. I'm going to show you a set of pictures, and I'm not going to say anything. And ever since I've been working with these pictures, I was inspired by a man named Alan Trachtenberg at Yale that actually Bill Ferris introduced me to a long time ago. And I sat with Alan in Pasadena, California, at a Mexican restaurant. We looked at these pictures. And I learned just so much from watching him look at the pictures and how he responded. And so one thing that I learned from him is just this idea we all read images differently based on a lot of different things. Our backgrounds, our paths, whether we liked our mother or not, whether we got along, with our brothers and sisters, whether, we were raised in one particular religion or not, or whether we've forsaken that religion now. There's so many factors in that. And so I learned from Alan just this idea of, we read images anew all the time. We also read it so individually. And then we're reading it collectively here. And we're creating a reading right now of the images. And that's out here in the space between the images and each one of you and all of us. So I'm not going to say anything about these particular pictures. I'm just going to show them to you for, less than 10 seconds, more than 5. I read something about how long people, when they go to like the Museum of Modern Art or the Met or whatever, how long they actually stand in front of an image, a painting or a sculpture, whatever. And it's like that, and it's even getting worse, I think. So, we're just gonna look at these pictures now, and Morella's gonna turn the lights off so we can see them a little better. I will say that the house where I grew up was 4 blocks down. We don't have a laser pointer, I'll leave a finger. My house was 4 blocks down that street, right there. And oh, by the way, that's where Tennessee Williams lived when he was a toddler, a baby. And Morella is going to be coming back. And she's going to take us to the next slide. Oh, I have my clicker. Oh, okay, good. So, let's see. Oh, it works.
Hooray.
So I'm part of the reunion class of 51 to 60 of Pruitt in terms of when my photographs were made by Pruitt, when he took my picture. So that's Pruitt on the right, and then that's his son on the left, Marvin Lambeth Pruitt, who became a photographer, and that's his brother in the center, Jim, who became a photographer. So like I say, they got their domain name early on in the early 20th century, and they've got their large format cameras there. You see, there's also a circuit camera for the people who are what we call photographic gearheads. That makes panorama images like the first one you saw. So I'm the smallest person in the photograph. I'm in my mother's lap. And the psychological analysis of this image with me in her lap and being the youngest explains a lot, perhaps, about me. And I like to say, well, that's why I became a journalist for 25 years, because I was designated the place of just listening to all these other people talking all the time. I didn't really have any agency or standing, and that kind of carried throughout my life, it seems like, with this group of people. My 3 brothers are in there, and then my cousins. My grandmother, Gaddy, was her nickname. She's in the center with an orchid that my Aunt Virginia raised. The women all have orchids that Virginia raised. So that's in my grandmother's living room, which was around the block from where I grew up. And Pruitt would come there Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter. And Trixie is the dog that my grandmother has in her lap. So I started this in the mid-'70s with 2 other friends, a photographer named Bernie Imes, who later did an amazing book called Juke Joint, among others, and then another photographer named Mark Gooch. And we were taking pictures. And we were in our early 20s, and that's where we came upon this, the negatives. Pruitt lived from 1891 to 1967, and after World War II, he hired an assistant, Calvin Shanks. And so Calvin took over the business around 1960. And so Pruitt had already died once we found all the negatives in Calvin's studio. And it took us 13 years to acquire the collection. When we first saw it, we began to realize this is like incredible, just boxes and boxes and boxes, and they were off-gassing. There was a vinegar smell. There were glass plates. There were large format, 8x10, 5x7, 4x5. Calvin unfortunately died when he was 55 in 1983. And then his widow and family sold him to a guy, Billy Frates, who ran a knit and stitch shop and a hardware store. His mother had the knit and stitch shop mostly. She sold yarn and knitting needles. And Billy sold shotguns, shotgun shells, fishing rods, stoves, refrigerators. But he liked pictures of trains that Pruitt took. So he had him up in a loft in the hardware store, and we would go visit him and say, Billy, you know, really need to take care of these things. Anyway, after 4 years, Billy agreed. And then Billy also told us, oh, and by the way, Ms. Shanks has some pictures that you need to see that she didn't give to us. And we discovered those were of the lynching of Burt Moore and Dooley Morton, and then also the executions of Jesse Patterson and another execution of James Keaton. Those were 1933 and 1934. And that's a whole other story that I can't tell tonight, except you're getting the drift of it. So that was a strange negotiation with Mrs. Shanks and her son Wayne, who was a county lineman about our age, it took us several weeks, and we acquired the collection. So, next slide. What was amazing is, okay, I think it's Richard Ford, you know, sometimes he poo-poos the idea of the South not being any place special, you know. But I was kind of amazed to see who was in Columbus, when they were there, what was going on. Actually, it's UNC Press's 100th anniversary right now. And in its early days, I think 1926, so it would have been 4 years old, they published Newell Niles Puckett, Folk Beliefs of the Southern Negro. Well, Newell Niles Puckett was from Columbus. He did his dissertation at Yale, and the majority of his informants were from the brickyard that the Pucketts owned, and then also other blacks around northeast Mississippi. Faulkner used to come to Columbus quite often. I can't go into the whole genealogy of why he's coming. He's coming there because his stepchildren's grandparents were there, and he'd come. Henry Armstrong had 3 championships: lightweight, featherweight, welterweight, I think. He's from Columbus. He wrote a great book, God, Guts, and Glory. He was a black man. Emmett Stringer was president of the NAACP. I interviewed him a year before he died, and he didn't tell me his whole story, but I tell some of it in the book. He didn't tell me that he was subject to the Ku Klux Klan murder, death threat. He told me other things, but he didn't tell me that, which was interesting. Red Barber lived in Columbus at the same time as Tennessee Williams. I don't know if they knew each other, but they were there. Same time, population 10,000, 2 white kids, possible. They could have had play dates or been in the same, you know, daycare at church or something. Tennessee Williams lived there only for like 2.5, 3 years. His grandfather, Walter Dakin, was the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Charles Henry Ford, Ruth Ford. Ruth Ford was an actor on Broadway. She co-wrote Requiem for a Nun and starred in it. Faulkner was the other writer of Requiem for a Nun. Charles Henry Ford published a journal called Blues. He was barely 21. He wrote Gertrude Stein, William Carlos Ford Maddox Ford, and others, and got them to submit manuscripts. His father was the manager of the Gilmer Hotel. after that first issue, he moved straight to New York, and then pretty soon he and a friend of his moved to Paris, and they wrote a homoerotic novel that was banned in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. The rest of that is another story, but he came back to and lived at the Dakota for about 40 years. I thought he was dead. And then my friend Lisa Howard said, no, he's not dead. You know,
He's just at the Dakota.
He's at the Dakota, but then he died before I could get there. And then I found other people who came from Columbus would go visit him, had gone to visit him, and he was incredibly welcoming to anybody. I missed the chance to interview Charles Henry Ford. And of course, Big Joe Williams, Betty Please Don't Go, Bucka White, Columbus, Mississippi Blues, Jailhouse Blues, and Howlin' Wolf. Did Pruitt take their pictures? He did take Emmett Stringer's picture. He did take Tennessee Williams' picture. And when I get a chance, I'll look through the 88,000 negatives and see if these other people are in there. There's Tennessee Williams with Walter Dakin in the center, who was in some ways a model for some of the Episcopal priests you find in Williams' work. And that's a banker, Episcopal lay reader, Davis Petty, on the left. And I'm hoping to interview Davis's niece, who's in her 90s, and she just got a copy of the book and was looking at it. So I'd love to go see her with a camera, maybe in a few weeks. So a lot of this happened before Google. This is a print. I didn't find the negative until actually it was at Wilson Library that I found it. I had a print. And for 10 years, I'd ask people, well, do you know who this guy is? And then also I'm reading through the back issues of the local newspaper, Commercial Dispatch. So I started in 1915 and go forward. Couldn't find anybody knew who he was. I get to 1934, and there he is on the front page of the Commercial Dispatch, and it had a caption, Sylvester and his mule Jesse. Sylvester couldn't make his mortgage payments on his house and his farm that he and his brother owned south of town. So Sylvester had been listening to the fireside chats. He decided to drive into town and call President Roosevelt and see if he'd help out the working man in Mississippi. And Sylvester was on the phone for 90 minutes. He reached the president, told him the story. The president says, okay, I'll help you, and the president did. After that, Sylvester went viral. Newsreels, Paramount and Fox Movie Time came to see Sylvester. Pruitt took the picture. The picture ended up in the New York Times. It also ended up in the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier. It ended up in black newspapers and white newspapers. So I said, from doing research that I've since done, mostly before Google, that it was the white press that brought Sylvester to our attention, but it was truly the black press that celebrated him as a spunky folk hero. And actually, I just found Sylvester's daughter and then granddaughter, and I'm going to go with him back out to where this house used to be. The house isn't there anymore. In Morella. I just realized we skipped over.
Yeah, the first video.
Yeah, do the first one. Here, we'll go back here.
Oh.
Not that far. Okay, this is a 4-minute and 40-second video for people who like to keep track of those kind of things. Have you got the sound? terms of providing a window and doorway to understanding what we can learn from a highly racially segregated environment in Northeast Mississippi in the 1920s.
Can you hear it, Nina?
and 50s.
Nope, needs to go
These
louder.
pictures tell an amazing story that goes back in time, and it also comes forward to this very day that I sit here in time.
This photographer was not specifically looking at race in America. What he was doing was looking at America. He was looking at a town in the South, in Mississippi. He did not seem to have a motive or a thesis. All he was doing was showing life.
He obviously had an urge and a desire to make a record. It may not be any different than somebody who wants to go to their diary and write 3 sentences, but it's a photographic version of that. And I think that that the accretion of doing that over and over and over again in the same place is really the genius of it.
Viewing race or having access to discussions about race through this type of collection is so valuable, because it reminds us that race is actually part of the fabric of the life of this town.
The range of emotions and people and places is deeply touching, and thankfully Pruitt bore witness to those moments with his camera. To have all of those photographs carefully preserved and now studied and presented as they've been is truly a national treasure.
It benefits so much from the commitment of those that acquired the collection to really work it, to really put it out there, to understand it, but also to share it.
It's a partnership between this magnificent photography of Pruitt, the amazing archivists who are working on it, and scholars like Berkley Hudson, who has devoted his life to preserving and to transforming this material, which is part of his heritage as a Mississippian, and sharing it with the world.
I'm excited by the potential of this collection to change the perspective of the viewers, to allow access to deeper engagement in this issue as not a Black people issue, not a people of color issue, but as an American issue.
I think anyone who takes the time to just look slowly, look deeply at the Pruitt photographs will be rewarded in ways that it's hard to imagine until you have that experience. It's like a deer coming up to a pond of cool water and just drinking deeply from it. That's what that experience can be like.
You want the other video?
Not yet, we're gonna change when we do that. I'm thinking about it. This is Locke Zoo, one of the richest people in town had a zoo that included camels. This is Oscar West. I showed people that picture for 10 years too before Google, and eventually this little old white lady that I knew, who was in her 90s, told me she knew who he was, and she gave me the name of one of his children. And then I found his son, Oscar Lang, and we met in his kitchen and we talked about his dad. He had never seen this photograph of his father. So, Truman Capote's mother's on the right. This image, you can't really see her that well, but she's there at the far right. Truman Capote's the guy with the white hat next to Madame Flozella, there in the turban. What? Truman Capote's father, sorry. Truman Capote's father. Mother's in the far right, father's in the white hat. Madame Flozell is next to Truman Capote's father, and the great Pasha's in the back. Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight boxing champion, is there next to the coffin. They all wound up in Columbus in 1930, November, for bargain days. So the local newspaper wanted to get people to come to town. So they brought all these people to town, and the great Pasha and Madame Flozella went around being buried alive from town to town. Truman Capote was about 5.5 or 6 at this time. George Plimpton, in a biography of Truman Capote, talks about how Truman Capote's mother, Lily Mae Falk Persons, met Jack Dempsey on a train going from Memphis to St. Louis. Jack Dempsey's handler was instructed to introduce Truman's mother to the champ, and that happened. Truman was sent off to go have a Coca-Cola, I think, in the dining car for a good long while. And that's sort of how they all came together there in Columbus sometime later. Truman Capote, 17 years or so later, wrote a short story called A Tree of Night about a buried alive carnival act that's on a train going from New Orleans to Atlanta, as I recall. They're sitting across from a female college student who's baffled by this couple smelling of gin. That was published in Harper's Bazaar, and it was bizarre. So this section deals with the executions of James Keaton. I'm going to show you that picture. I'm not going to show you the photograph of the lynching of Burton Warren Duty Morton, but that is in the book. So I acknowledge that there's a lot of different ethical issues around photographs like this and display of photographs, publishing photographs. And I've been dealing with that for over 30 years as the sensibilities of our country and world have changed. What I had the good fortune to have as my mentor, Deborah Willis, a MacArthur genius at NYU, who's considered one of the experts internationally on photography, and especially black photography. And she encouraged me to go to a conference at Emory University in the year 2000. And I was on a panel with other scholars talking about racial violence and lynching, and it changed my life. And Deborah says, you've got to keep talking about this because people need to hear it. So that's what I've been doing. This is a school group in blackface. These are white people dressed up like black people, sort of. This is before the execution of James Keaton, 1934. On the Lowndes County Courthouse grounds, there were 2 executions around this time that Pruitt photographed. I'll tell you one quick story. In around 1994, I went to the courthouse asking people if they knew about executions or lynchings in town. And I went to see the Chancery clerk, a white man. There were black women working out front as clerks. I went into the Chancery clerk's office and I asked him about that. I said, do you know anything about executions or lynchings? And he says, no, I don't, but I know a good number of people that could use a hanging. I used to deliver the newspaper to Fred Hazlett, James Keaton. I used to deliver the newspaper to Mrs. Hazlett, widow Hazlett, and I never knew why she was a widow. James Keaton was convicted of killing Fred Hazlett. It wasn't until I engaged with these photographs that I realized that's why she was widow Hazlett. And then later I met with Fred Hazlett's son, and actually at the UNC library there are Hazlett relatives who work there now, and I was in a talk here a few years ago, and they were in the back of the room. So I begin to see that there's a web that these pictures have that go out all over the place. Pruitt's studio is on Main Street. And here's the Ku Klux Klan coming down Main Street. I have some things posted on Facebook now about this, and I would say 95% of the comments that people are putting on there are very positive. Though someone posted the other day a picture of the 1925 March in Washington, D.C., the Ku Klux Klan, and said, there wasn't a single Confederate flag in that march. You realize that? I didn't respond to that person. So when I was trying to find out about the lynching, like I said, I was reading through the newspapers, and one day I came upon the newspapers in the morgue, interestingly enough. That's the idea of old newspapers, called them morgue. And there were these holes in the front pages, so 2 days in a row. And somebody had cut out what was there. I couldn't figure out what they cut out. So I went to the local library, and the microfilm was cut out. And I said, where'd that come from? They said, it came from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And so I was living in Los Angeles at the time. I went back to Los Angeles, and I went to the downtown library that Susan Orlean has made famous in her book. And I said, can you order the microfilm for this day for the Commercial Dispatch? They got it from UMI in Michigan, which is a storehouse. They sent that to me, and there on the microfilm were stories about the lynching of Burt Moore and Dooley Morton that had been cut out. So once I found that, then I can look everywhere. So I went to the New York Times and found the story there. The New York Herald Tribune found the story there. And then I was able to compare how all this was covered. And I went to the Chicago Defender. So I was on a real journey at that point. And there's a story within all of that. Here's a death certificate for Dooley Morton that I asked for. I got this about in the mid-2000s. And so I asked for Dooley Morton's death certificate, and I asked for Burt Moore's death certificate. There is no death certificate for Burt Moore. We have visual evidence that Burt Moore, in fact, was lynched. The Mississippi Department of Vital Records has no record of Burt Moore being lynched. Morella, we've got something playing here that we do. Thank you. So at the same time, there are lynchings and executions or baptisms. Charles Wilson is an expert on religion in the South at the University of Mississippi. He's been working with me, along with Bill Ferris, on working with these pictures. And Charles says he's never seen photographs like this. There are lots of pictures of baptisms. Black people baptizing, white people baptizing. This is a photograph of white people and black people at the same time baptizing on the Tombigbee River. I showed this to my mother when she was in her 80s. My mother moved to town when she was 8 years old. She said, well, yeah, we used to go to those baptisms. My brothers, my sister, we used to go down there. I said, why'd you never tell me? Well, I didn't think you'd want to know about that. So she said, yes, this was happening. What we don't know is who baptized first or not. We don't know that. But what we know is they're there together at the same time being photographed together in some measure of common ground in terms of Christianity. So Pruitt was a white man who could move easily in the white community, but also the black community. The images that he made, largely the black community that I can find, are in their homes, in their churches, and then also in the segregated public spaces. But on the right is the James Mann family, 1943. Bell Hooks has written very eloquently about the role of the image in the black family and how it is, serves as what she would call a counter-hegemonic against the discombobulated black family. So myself and my friends had these photographs for a long time. And some were in Columbus, Mississippi, some were in Birmingham, Alabama. They were off-gassing as we go, off-gassing as we go. And we kept thinking, I figured out we needed $250,000 in 1994. That's before like scanners and all that. And so I was working with Tom Rankin, and he'd been working in another small town in Mississippi with a glass plate collection of 12,000 negatives. So he says, well, you can make like copy negatives of everything. And you can then archivally sleeve them all and all that. And I added up the cost of $250,000. We decided we didn't have that. So that was a moment of recognition for us. And then there was a tornado in Birmingham, and Mark Gooch is on the left. He's a photographer. Bernie Young is on the right. He's a photographer down in the center. And we realized we had to wash the negatives by hand. And that was a scary process for us to realize these are very vulnerable and they need a safe place. So one of the places we had them was upstairs in the Masonic Temple. And I've got this 1987 to 2005. Well, Katrina happened. And Katrina, with 60-mile-an-hour winds in Columbus, blew some of the windows out there on the second floor where a lot of those negatives were. And that was while we were in the process of negotiating with UNC at Chapel Hill Wilson Library. And so that heightened my desire to close the deal with UNC. That was after myself and my partners wrenchingly couldn't find a place, and it was heart-wrenching. We couldn't find a place in Mississippi that had the wherewithal to take these negatives. So we have an agreement with UNC that there will be web links, digital links, human links, and all that kind of stuff with Mississippi. But they're here, hardly a mile away, safe and sound in Wilson Library. So these are some places. And UNC said, oh, and Ken Burns uses our library. So, okay. That sounds good. And I have a donor who told me, wealthy woman in Mississippi, she says, you get Ken Burns to make a documentary and I'll give you a lot of money. I said, okay, I'll catch up with you when I can do that. So that's where the negatives are. And that's my hand looking at, gloved hand looking at some glass plates. Have to pay homage to Eudora Welty and her great set of photographs from the 1930s when she was photographing in Mississippi. So Pruitt was a conservative white man who went to the Methodist Church, who drank a little bit of Mogan David wine before he went to bed at night, and was known to tell smutty jokes. He was a photography addict. He loved hunting, fishing, and taking pictures. That's it. His wife took care of the business. They'd have gone broke if he didn't. Deborah Willis looked at this picture in about 2001 when I made a print of it. She said, Chicago bound. Oh, sorry. Those are Grecian dancers, as it were, from Mississippi State College for Women in the back of the Sanders home. I worked with Catherine Lutz, who's a cultural anthropologist, when I was working on my PhD at UNC. And she was great at helping me look at gender and how people are arrayed in the images, who's where, who's not where the white women are, where the black women are, where the white men are, where the black men are. She did a book called Reading National Geographic. It was a 100-year study of National Geographic and the various gazes that are present in the National Geographic. This is the Macon, Mississippi Dramatic Club. And if you were a close reader of the New York Times, you would have noticed just the other day there was a story about a woman in Noxubee County, which is Macon, Mississippi, and she's started an effort on black ancestry. But this is they were up to something different here. This is a member of Miller's Traveling Museum, a freak show that came to town. One of the other people in the freak show was Three-Ball Charlie. He's a black man who would, his mouth was made really wide with balls that he would put in his mouth. It's also on the cover of Exile on Main Street, the Rolling Stones album. Three-Ball Charlie. Columbus was a honeybee capital for a long time. This bee's on Main Street. I discovered Walter Benjamin when I got my PhD. I'm glad I did. I was okay before knowing about him, but he helped me learn a lot of things. So the traveling exhibit, if you want to go to Columbus, Mississippi between now and April 23rd at 2 p.m., you can see the exhibit. And then there's a website that I'm building out slowly but surely. I've done interviews with, I have like interviews of like 50 people. I have video interviews with a woman who was 7 years old, a white woman, and her father was a barber, and he wanted her to see what mob violence looked like, and he took her to see the lynched bodies of Burt Moore and Dooley Morton. And I have interviews with all kinds of different people responding to the images. So that's the book, which is available at Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I think we'll stop there because we'll stop for questions. Yes? What's that? No, we've given them a taste. Actually, I'm going to put Sylvester's Mule Blues, which Memphis Minnie wrote after she heard about Sylvester Harris. And I think it's either on the website or I'll get it on there. You can watch that. It was made, the video was made by a documentary student of mine, B. Wallace, who was a master's student, who then came, left Mizzou after she got her master's, and then she came and worked with Tom Rankin at Duke and got her MFA there. And she's the mother of 3 small children and lives in Burlington. And in spirit, she is here tonight with us. So we have time for questions. We have 17 minutes.
Of the 88,000 images, would you say that you eventually, and others might be able to rescue them all?
One of the things that I was hopeful about was getting grants. I did help UNC along with Deborah Willis' help. We got a grant from the Mellon Foundation about 10 years ago to just start archiving them. But we still need much more. I can't remember the count on how many photographs are in Wilson Library. Maybe we'll call it 10 billion. And so what I've learned, whether it's Walker Percy's family or me, who come to the library and they donate things, and I also learned this when my wife and I were working with a man named Lloyd Coates at Princeton on his collection. And once you've given the gift, you can have all the letters in the world, but it doesn't matter how rich you are or whatever. It's just attention drifts, priorities drift. So, but in a while, I'm going to have enough energy to knock on the door of the new librarian who will be here and replace Elaine Westbrooks, who actually is leaving. I've been through several librarians and several, universities. Not a lot of turnover. So, but my goal is to get them, in effect, what I was saying when I thought it was $250,000. I want every one of them sleeved perfectly, copied that needs to be copied perfectly, double whatever negatives we need, So I'm hopeful we can get grants to do that.
We'll go back to Melvin for sure.
Yeah, well, right, yes. The problem is there was a pandemic and so on and so forth. So I was doing a book and an exhibit, and, but yes, no. My children want to know when I'm coming back, but and my wife, Mildred Birch, the storyteller, does too. So I'm trying to strike a balance. The good news is they're in Wilson Library and not in the Masonic Temple in Columbus, Mississippi. I have a question.
Yeah, I got a question.
David Di Giuseppe, accordion extraordinary.
When you were developing the negatives, did you play with the processing at all, or are those pretty much as were photographed?
Well, when I was taking a class from Deborah Willis in printing, I was doing my best. But, so Douglas Zinn over here commented how good the quality of the book, the reproduction of the book was. He knows about photographs. So what I'll say to this is, I have an incredible exhibition designer that Deborah Willis led me to in Pasadena, California, named Graham Howe. And he toned the images for the exhibit and the book. And it was just right. They're just right. And the prints in the exhibit, when people come in and see the exhibit, they go, wow, the prints are really good. They're really good. So that's what matters more than what I had tried to do. Or, you know, I mean, my friends Mark Gooch, who did and God Made a Farmer, he did the Super Bowl ad and was one of the photographers on that. And Bernie Adams is a large format photographer, all his work. And he had the same printer as William Eggleston. I mean, they know a lot about photography. And they all agree. We got a really beautiful book with great prints, and the exhibit has great prints. So, but it's a tricky thing because digital is so much better than it used to be. Like, it's a good thing it took me this so long. Like, I used to go to Wilson Library and I'd say, show me your scanner, or show me the, and you know, it's a state of the art. And then you'd look at it and you go, that doesn't look good. I mean, you know, it doesn't look like a real print. But now they look like real prints. So that's the good news about that it took so long. So the toning is not, and actually the tone on this isn't right, but that's okay. I mean, you get the idea. There's something in the monitors. Martin.
Berkley, I think you said that there were roughly four friends of yours who initially found the photos and stuff.
Yeah, 5 of us.
What role did they have in putting all this together? I mean, it's a monumental task.
Well, one of them, Jim Carnes, who's a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, 1977, English. He went from here to Encyclopedia Britannica for 10 years. He left Britannica and he moved back to Birmingham to write a novel. And so he started going through the negatives at a certain point. And then, so Jim really helped find some things. And then I took what they call a voluntary buyout. It was voluntary. I left the LA Times to work on this.
Oh, really?
In 1994. And I don't want to go into, anyway, so I worked on it a lot, but then we lived all over the country. I lived in Los Angeles. Bernie Youngs lives in Columbus, Mississippi. Mark lives in Birmingham. So they haven't had that much to do with it since then, though we all did meet at UNC. UNC brought us all here, and everybody was satisfied this was the best home for it. So it's mostly been me since then. But it wouldn't have happened if the 5 of us didn't band together. I mean, it was like a 10-legged sack race, which I will not be engaged in anymore. That was a hard lesson to learn. It's too many people with too many opinions. But they're all, I love them all. I've known them some since we were in a, what do they call them in Britain, a pram. I've known them since I was 6 months old, some of them. And we're still friends. That's the amazing part. We're still friends, even though a number of deals fell through, including with Knopf. That's another story. So, what else you got?
Wait, Taylor, up front.
Did Pruitt leave much writing about his photographs?
No, he did not. He liked hunting, fishing, and taking pictures. But actually, in the exhibit, there's a dentist in Columbus who's got the notebook that Miss Pruitt kept when the Mississippi State College for Women graduating class was photographed by Pruitt, and all students' names are in there. There are like 80 of them that paid like $2.50. Everybody's name's in there, tells where they're from. She's written down who owes, who's paid. He didn't write anything down, but like on the Jack Dempsey pictures and all that kind of stuff, he would write on the he'd write on the negative of like the Jack Dempsey pictures. We had a minor controversy when we were doing the book. Alexa Dilworth is one of the editors here from Duke. She is here with us right here. Could you raise your hand, please, Alexa? So, this is like the difference in Presbyterians and atheists and Buddhists and Zoroastrianism. So, Pruitt wrote like Pruitt photo on a lot of things. He had like a signature, but most of the time it was just that, like Pruitt photo. And that was especially in the 20s and 30s. When we were doing the book, there was a debate whether to include that or not. Well, Graham Howe in Pasadena, the exhibition designers, he thinks you remove all that, because actually there's a great picture that I didn't show you of Jack Dempsey and the Pasha, and you can really see the grave they cut into the earth and pine straw that's on the dirt around it. But there's a signature that goes all across that says, Jack Dempsey, Great Pasha, buried alive, November 30th. It really distracts from your being able to see the pine straw. I mean, you can pick up that pine straw, but you can't when that signature is across it. So we struck a balance in that book. There's only a few with the signatures. 5, I think we had 5 with the signatures. So Graham, the exhibition designer who toned all the images for the book and exhibit, he removed all the signatures. We had him put them back, 5 back, at the end of the production cycle.
You're welcome.
One other small question. Pruitt, did he make a sort of, he survived doing his photography, right? He was paid for some of his work, right?
Right, he was paid for, he worked for like lawyers, insurance companies. I mean,
Okay.
He took pictures of bodies after they were shot for the police department. You know, in the Depression, he traded like chickens and eggs, and he bartered and that sort of thing. But remember, most of these people in the 20s didn't have a camera. And so that was the first time for a lot of them to have their picture made. So, I mean, he set his prices where most people could afford it. You know, a lot of people could afford it. But yes, he made a living.
He didn't need to make a lot of money, obviously. He didn't need to make a lot of money. He just wanted to fish.
Yeah, he didn't need to make a lot of money. I mean, he moved to a nice house, you know, from one place. Actually, the first house he lived in, he had a house out back where he had a black assistant, Amzai, whose name I'm still trying to determine his last name. But that man who worked with Pruitt lived in the back of Pruitt's house. But no, he moved into a nice house, but he was a respected member of the white middle class. He was neither rich nor poor, but he was part of the power structure in a small town. Yes?
Do you see the exhibit coming here?
Well, I'd like to see it coming here. I'd like to have a meeting with the people who can make it come here. And I've been talking about going to lunch with those kind of people soon. So, and anyway, it's an interesting thing, as you know, like the role of where does this kind of photography, vernacular photography, fit in. But if you look at Michael Disfarmer, who became the darling, you know, of the photo world, and Alan Trachtenberg helped that, like in the mid-70s. So Disfarmer was in Heber Springs, Arkansas. His negatives were, and he worked in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, mostly white people in this small town in Arkansas. The negatives were found, I don't remember, Greenhouse Barn somewhere, you know.
and somebody bought her for a song, and now there's been, there was like a half dozen Disfarmer books, and Disfarmer was like what Vivian Mayer was a few years ago. But what I'll say this about Pruitt, and I just had an incredible exchange with Dorothea Lange's granddaughter, and it's just kind of amazing how she found me and contacted me and left a note, but I didn't realize that's who it was. But the name, Diana Taylor. So eventually, I figured it out from something she had written in a little memo line. And so I tried to email her, wrong email, and I looked up some more emails from her. I got the right email. She answered me like in 10 minutes when I got the right email. The other emails had gone to her production company. So she wrote a beautiful note, and she says, these images must be seen. They illuminate things that even my grandmother, Dorothea Lange, did not do in her several trips to the southern states. So, I think I can make a good pitch, but it is tricky with museums. And actually, we're trying to get it into maybe the Center for Photography in Arizona right now to try to. People see this as a regional exhibit in some ways. People, those kind of people, the museum kind of people. But what I've begun to discover, I've had people from Brazil look at these pictures and they get it. One of the people who made the little video, the 4-minute video of Bill Ferris and me and Tom, he was from Syria. He was in the Syrian army, and he got it. And he said, "This reminds me of Syria." And I just said, "What?" And he explained it. It connects. So I think it needs to be here. I think it needs to be at Duke. It needs to be at UNC. There needs to be a partnership, which we've talked about. So yes. Thanks for asking. We have time for another question. Anything is okay. They're okay questions. All questions are okay. One thing I have discovered, which I mentioned, is regardless of what people's beliefs are, they are finding common ground in these photographs. And I was shocked in Mississippi, the town where I grew up. I left and a lot of people stayed. And I've been talking with a lot of those people who stayed, and they came to the exhibit. They traveled from Orange Beach, Florida, they traveled from Jackson, Mississippi, and they all came. And somehow they're able to negotiate, the whole range of images. They find an image that they like, and if they don't want to think about the execution or the lynching, they don't think about it. And I discovered that when I used to show pictures to people. I showed that picture of those black-faced kids to this old white woman, Nanny Kate Smith, one time. She looked at it and she just kind of laughed and she says, She said, "What else you got?" So it's interesting to see the degree that people are willing to think about or engage with the photographs and how they choose to engage with them. I had a 45-minute conversation with a guy who's a big game hunter that owns 10 heavy equipment truck stores in Mississippi, and we used to be in the Boy Scouts together. He couldn't stop talking about Shelley, who won the Westminster Cup, in 1906, and then moved to Columbus after he had gone to Africa with Paul Rainey, and they had killed 20 lions that ended up as the Rainey Group in the American Museum of Natural History. Well, Mike Waters just wants to talk about Shelley, and how Shelley bred dogs that the president of Standard Oil used to have delivered to his plantation in South Carolina. But at the same time, what I found is when I have the conversations with them, then we can talk about some other things maybe. So without further ado, we have 30 seconds to spare, and that'll help Morella feel comfortable that we're leaving on time. So thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you and to engage with you in this way. Thank you. Yeah, there you go.
Just a minute, but.
I know. Okay. I'm like, we're all friends at this point. We're all friends.
Yes, now that we're outside for the